I just have a few slides I'd like to show. Also like Betsy and the theme of connectivity. And just a few snippets, and I'll show you a little bit of what it was like to be in Lynn's lab. So this is a hastily written PhD defense notice. That was definitely part of who Lynn was. Someone that swept you along in the fervor of what she was doing, often last minute. I'm surprised she did this one herself. This was something she would often have to delegate to someone else. I graduated in 1987. And of course, it goes without saying that it was a really wonderful experience to have worked with Lynn the number of years that I did. I won't be talking about that except to say that her work became intrinsic in my work, inextricable throughout the rest of my career. And I can't talk about that, but we're just going to talk about a couple of things that I think are a little more fun. There I am the same day as that hastily written note. And what I'm looking at is a lab book, scrapbook photo album given to me by Lynn and the members of the lab. So you might wonder what was in that book. Well, it wouldn't be surprising. On the left-hand side, that's Donna Mijos, who was one of my cohorts. And then there, of course, is Dorian, and Dorian's wife at the time, Marjorie, who's Tonio's mother. So that makes a little sense. In fact, Betsy Dyer, who was just up here, Bob Obard, John Stoltz, Greg Hinkle, Lorraine Olenzinski were all in that book. Many people here, in fact, were probably also in that book. But as you flip through the pages, you start to notice a theme, which is that the book had people that, well, I knew Maury, of course, and I think many people here probably did. But you start to get a theme, which is that it's a lot about Lynn's family. And I'm not the first person here to say that, so I'm really just underscoring that. And so as you flip through that book, by the time you get to the end of the pages, there's actually more pictures of Tonio Sagan than there are of anything else, including spirochetes, which is what I did my PhD thesis on. Well, when people ask me what Lynn was like, my colleagues, etc., I usually tell them that Lynn was extraordinarily generous. And people are often surprised that I say that. They're not surprised that Lynn was generous. They're just surprised that that's the thing I choose to say. And the reason is they expect me to say something else, to choose that, to say that she was brilliant, which of course she was, or to ask me about some idiosyncrasy, which of course there were many things that I could have said. But Lynn had more to give than most people, and that's why I especially remember her that way. Now the connectivity was the many little notes. There was no paper that was published while you were a graduate student that you didn't read the final draft with a little inscription from Lynn, that you didn't read all the prior drafts. If you were writing things to Lynn, with Lynn, or for Lynn, or about Lynn in the 1980s, I've probably read it. I've read most of the drafts. People have mentioned the phone calls from Lynn, and while I had those too, the things I cherished the most are the letters. I have to say at the time I didn't necessarily cherish them, I somewhat dreaded them. The letters were a combination. Well, of course, you know, she was often just lucid and free-flowing in the form. But the letters also had a list of things that I needed to do and were essentially sort of a kind of assignment for me. But they also had some fun and things that are of interest. The enclosed fantasy would be an example. What was that? It was the idea for a conference, and it was one that she thought I would help her organize. She had a list of people that she thought would be good to come. She asked me to help think of other people to have come. So that was the kind of thing that she shared, and I believe that actually became the conference that Renee Fester helped organize and put into the book on the symbiosis as a source of evolutionary innovation. Of course, you can see Lynn's sense of humor, too. Broadest range of dates, infinity. Okay, no one would argue with that. And who's going to handle the costs? Sugar daddies. I don't know how we're doing for time. I don't have a lot of time, but I'll just read you a couple of the things. This is the other part of the connectivity. Several people mentioned some of these things today. For example, speculation on speculation, or you don't have to have syphilis to have spirochetes in the brain. Big trouble in biology was mentioned, and the role that autopoiesis has in the environment, and how we are trying to understand evolution. And then finally, undulopodia before mitochondria. And those of you that really know the serial endosymbiotic theory will note that there were two different versions of the SET diagram shown today. And I think Antonio Lascano actually showed both of them. And the talk just before this also mentioned it, whether undulopodia came first or later. And so I and the other students that were Lynn's students all got to participate in those conversations, and at least in part, that's how we are also interconnected with each other. I'd just like to read a quote, something that I found when I was a student of Lynn's, taking her evolution course, something that I thought applied to her undulopodia theory. Reading it now, I think you can see that it might have applied to many different things that Lynn was investigating. She loved this quote. I think she included it a couple times. Anyone whose disposition leads them to attach more weight to unexplained difficulties than to the explanation of a certain number of facts will certainly reject my theory. I'll leave you with one last slide, a picture that I'll include in my graduate students' photo album. Thank you.
Very much. I'm going to be very brief. I was a student of Max Taylor at UBC in 1973, 4, and 5, and Max is the person who actually coined the term serial endosymbiosis theory in a famous paper that was published in Taxon. And he did it because he was skeptical of the theory that Lynn had put forward. And Max had been working on a symbiont, which was a ciliate, which engulfs an alga. It's called Mesodynium rubrum. And he believed that plastids were the first major group that he could prove were an organelle that was taken in from the outside world. Now, subsequently, we've come to accept, I think, a world in which there are two known, provable, endosymbiotic associations, that being the mitochondria and the other being the plastid. And so Lynn has always been very, very controversial, but at the same time very warm. And so I met her in 1974 when she came to UBC, and she and Max got into large discussions, and they were very collegial. And I was very impressed. And I didn't see her for years later. Then we bumped into each other again when I was working on corals, and believe it or not, Elat. When she came to Elat, then I realized she was speaking French. She could speak a bit of Hebrew. She spoke Spanish. She spoke English. Who is this? You know, I mean, what was going on? And later I met her in Valencia. And then later on, I met her in various meetings. And when Peter Westbrook retired, we were there together. And over the years, I've taken more of a reductionist approach in my science. I have a biophysics lab, molecular biology lab. But I'm finishing now a book on evolution of life, those little machines, the Darwin eyeballs, that make the world go round. In the last 2 years, my daughter was at Hampshire College down the road, and I would come to visit Lynn with my daughter, and we'd have lunch. And she would make things just like she was making things there, you know, take a teaspoon of this, it doesn't taste quite right, throw in some, what have I got in the fridge, and come out with a really wonderful soup. And of course, it was Falkowski. I need a chapter. And I'd have to write a chapter for a book that she'd be writing or editing. Or Falkowski, I need a critique, and she'd send me some papers. And it was always one of these things where I felt very, very close to Lynn, and my daughter felt very close to Lynn. And I'm very proud, in a way, that she has mentored so many young women, especially, and so many scientists, and has always been so generous of her time, and so generous with her praise, and so generous with her ideas. And it's actually something that I wish I could aspire to. I really, it's a characteristic that I wasn't born with. I'm very critical, I'm very hard, and I'm very appreciative of her. Thank you.
She revered Emily Dickinson. I think she identified a little with the poet Emily Dickinson. Some of Dickinson's poems struck a chord in Lynn, and when talking about a poem, Lynn would tell me emphatically more than once that Dickinson was right on. Perhaps Lynn Margulis understood too well what it was like for Emily Dickinson's work to be ignored, even criticized when she was a young woman, and later to have her startlingly brilliant and original work rightly praised and accepted, primarily after her death. Incidentally, Dickinson had a very good science education in the 1840s in this small village of Amherst, at Amherst Academy and later at Mount Holyoke Female Seminary. She's also thought to have sat in on Amherst College classes, as girls could do in those days, especially if her grandfather was a founder, her father the treasurer, and the brother a student at the all-male college. Dickinson enjoyed a surprisingly modern curriculum of botany, zoology, geology, and chemistry, as well as Latin, French, and English. The Octagon at Amherst College then housed, in 1848, a natural history museum well before Harvard or Yale had one. And they had a telescope in the early 1850s there. I met Lynn Margulis 10 years ago. I knew who she was, but had never actually talked with her. I had given a paper to the 2001 Emily Dickinson International Society at Trondheim, Norway. There, I presented a well-researched and entirely new theory about William Smith Clark as a mysterious master figure, the married man that Emily Dickinson fell in love with when she was in her late 20s. This William Smith Clark was also a scientist. He was an Amherst College student, the first to go to Germany to get a PhD, and he came back and taught at Amherst College, and he taught chemistry and zoology and botany. And he was one of the founders of Massachusetts Agricultural College, which is now UMass. A scientist who understood Emily Dickinson, I believe. My paper was published in 2002 in the Johns Hopkins Emily Dickinson Journal. It was controversial, quite shocking, in fact, to elderly women who had imagined a virginal poet pining away in the attic, writing poems and letters to a minister in Philadelphia, Charles Wadsworth, whom she had met 2 or 3 times. In 2003, a friend told me that the ultra-intelligent Lynn Margulis had read my paper and agreed with my theory and said that of course I was right, that it made obvious sense to her. Naturally, I was flattered. One day, Lynn was at a celebration at the Emily Dickinson Museum where I work. I introduced myself and said that I heard she liked my paper on Dickinson and William Smith Clark. She got really excited, and so we discussed the book I was writing on Clark. From then on, she became my mentor, my friend, my nag. She pushed me to finish my book and always confronted me about what I still needed to do to send it to the publishers. She urged me to just finish the book, that I had enough research, more than enough, and much later she said it would make a wonderful film produced by her friend Terrence Malick. Flattery. Lynn Margulis recommended books to me also. One of them was Composing a Life by Mary Catherine Bateson. Bateson's book is all about an ideal of creativity arising from interdependence, nurturing, and imagination. and Lynn had become a nurturer beyond the call of duty to many of her female and male students, but also to a constant parade of other people like me of all ages. One day, she had publisher friends coming to see her from Chelsea Green, the people who published her books. She asked me to give the Chelsea Green people a private Dickinson museum tour, including my Clark Dickinson theory, and a reprint of the paper. I later joined them next door at her house for lunch. It was winter, and Lynn kept her house at 58 degrees, a chill I did not dress for. After book and publishing conversations, she cooked the ham, egg, and tortilla lunch as we continued talking. Later, she proudly showed me her office up in the garret of the house, where she also had a king-size mattress behind her when she worked under the eaves in case somebody dropped by that needed to stay overnight. Friends of her children, grandchildren, students, whatever. She was very generous. She then showed me also how she exercised her large, rambunctious rescue dog, and I'll tell you that in person if you want to know. It's really quite funny. On another occasion, Lynn had an editor from New York visiting, a man who now edits at Yale University Press. I was happy to give him, at Lynn's request, a private Dickinson tour in my reprinted article. One day at lunch at my house, I introduced Lynn to Margaret Freeman, a specialist on the German man who found over-the-top Freudian sexual codes in Dickinson writing. Lynn was interested and wanted merely to save his controversial papers for future scholars. The last time I talked with Lynn was last October. She told me she had an old auntie in Detroit, a place she knew I still needed to visit and research for my book. She said she could go with me and visit her auntie while I worked for a few days in the Detroit library. Alas, it never happened because I had other obligations, and then so did she. She suggested a title for my future book because she felt this is Dickinson who fell in love with a married man and it didn't work out for her. And she wrote very happy poems, but also some almost suicidal poems when she was apparently in love with whoever the married man was. And she feels this is Dickinson writing about that. For each ecstatic instant, we must an anguish pay in keen and quivering ratio to the ecstasy. For each beloved hour, sharp pittances of years, bitter contested farthings and coffers heaped with tears. I miss her.
I'm Elsa Dorfman, and I met Lynn Sagan in July of 1963 or 1964 at ESS, which was called the Elementary Science Study. She had come east with Kyle and Dorian and Jenna and me. She was finishing her PhD and getting ready to work with classroom teachers and hip scientists to develop elementary school curricula. I started around the same time as a classroom elementary teacher, and I was matched with Lynn. We were a team. Kennedy was president. It was the very, very, very first years of Gaia, subject of today's program, really. ESS, for that time, was unbelievable. The energy, the talent, the excitement. There was a scientist there who was 90, who was a biologist. In my own field, I'm a photographer. Bernice Abbott made physics photographs in the darkroom. It was that kind of a place. A lot of the people who were at ESS with me are dead. I cannot get over it. All of a sudden, Lynn was getting divorced. She had a duplex apartment in Watertown, and the boys were in a neighborhood home daycare. I forget where Sharon lived. We were 26 and 27. It was the 60s, and everyone was in and out of each other's lives. It was just another time. Lynn was figuring out how to finish her thesis and how to deal with Kyle. I remember when she threw out her wedding ring and when she threw away her wedding album. Done. Lynn was no drama queen. Every time he comes here, she would say of Carl, he takes a few more books. He insists that they're all his. And I don't know if you've ever had a friend that happened. That's like the most human thing in leaving and breaking up. I gave you that, or that was mine. I mean, I've seen that so much. Lynn was no girl I had ever met. She didn't do long telephone conversations. This is then, I can hear that she changed. She didn't labor over the psychology of friends. She didn't pass conversations. She didn't call to see how you were. No girl talk, absolutely no chit-chat. She was all facts and information, all understanding the material, solving real substantial scientific problems, how to make them understandable and simple, how to get to the bottom of an issue. Oh, she got mad at science politics, but not mad with the energy she had for ideas. Not like I could get mad and stew and roll out a narrative. She liked to have people congregate in her Watertown living room, a fundraiser for SNCC, showcasing filmmakers and 60s, 70s artist Bruce Conner, having dinner for her friend Ernie Callenbach when he came into town, inviting Jerry Letvin and Maggie over because she wanted to talk to him about his work. He was much older than we were at the time. I was amazed that they came. Lynn, on the other hand, took it for granted. Of course he would come. He had no idea who she was, but he would come. Lynn was totally focused on the doing. She looked like Joan Baez, and it was a time when girls wondered if they could do whatever it was. It's hard to go back to that time in your head. Would we be accepted? Were we smart enough? Lynn could learn anything, do anything, spin out any idea. You can imagine how great she was at getting little kids excited about science. She would have been at the top of any number of other fields had Carl not introduced her to science, seduced her into its multiple possibilities. Just like, who knows, she could have been an Emily Dickinson scholar in 9 languages. But she did worry about her children, and she did casually brag about what each one was doing. She breathlessly gave me a rundown and would say, "It'll be fine, it is fine," and on to the next subject. She did really suffer when Carl was sick. I don't think Lynn worried about or thought about those friends who weren't right in front of her. She loved us when she saw us at book signings, her lectures in Cambridge Forum, helping other scientists in trouble. She was Lynn Margulis by now, and Zach and Jenny were growing up. Her world of friends like me wondered how she was and adored her all the time. And when Nobel Prizes were announced every year, we shook our heads. Someday, someone will build on Lynn's work and win the prize.